Okay, in this video we're going to go into more detail on the structures and functions of the epidermis. Remember, the epidermis is the superficial layer of skin, and it's an epithelial tissue, specifically keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It makes sense that it's stratified squamous because it's protective in that regard, and it makes sense that it's keratinized because keratin is actually a really tough fibrous protein that gives skin its protective properties. The major cells of the epidermis are actually called keratinocytes. These are the cell types that you find in stratified squamous epithelium, and they are called that because they make keratin. Now, these cells are very tightly connected by desmosomes. Remember, desmosomes are the strongest of the intercellular junctions, so it makes sense that desmosomes would be found between these keratinocytes that make up the protective layer of your skin. Now, millions of these cells slough off every day, and that actually is consistent with the idea that epithelial tissues have a high regenerative capacity. So you actually replace your keratinized stratified squamous epithelium about once every 2 months. Now, in terms of other cell types of the epidermis, we also have melanocytes. Melanocytes are these spider-shaped cells located within the epidermis, and they actually are called melanocytes because they produce a pigmented molecule called melanin. Melanin is a type of organic molecule that's packaged into these little vesicles called melanosomes. And these melanosomes are actually transferred into the growing keratinocytes, so that keratinocytes are packed full of melanin from the melanocytes. Now, the function of melanin is actually involved with UV protection. So these melanocytes help to protect some of the cells of your skin from the damaging effects of UV radiation from the sun or other sources. Now, dendritic cells you also find in the epidermis, and there are these star-shaped mobile macrophages that patrol deep in your epidermis. They're also called Langerhans cells, and essentially these cells, you could say, walk around deep in the epidermis, and they essentially scavenge for microorganisms and debris and play a really key role in your immune system. Now, another cell type you find in the epidermis are the tactile cells or Merkel cells, and these are specialized sensory cells that can respond to light touch. So very light touch on your skin can excite receptors on these cells that actually can eventually lead to nerve impulses that your brain can interpret as touch. Now, in terms of the layers of epidermis, we find that it's actually made of 4 to 5 distinct layers. Now, we have thick and thin skin. Thick skin has all 5 layers, or strata. Strata means layer, so we have 5 of these in thick skin. Thick skin is non-hairy skin. And you're going to find thick skin in areas of high abrasion, like the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Thin skin only has 4 layers, only 4 strata. And we also think of thin skin as being hairy skin. So skin that has hair is going to be thin skin. Now, there are 5 layers of skin total. Remember, we have stratum basale, spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and corneum. Now, lucidum is the only one you find in thick skin, right? So it turns out that thin skin would only have basale, spinosum, granulosum, and then we would skip lucidum and go to corneum. Basale is the deepest, corneum is the most superficial. And it makes sense because think of basale as like basement, deeper. So basale is going to be the single layer of actively mitotic stem cells that can divide and then give rise to these other layers as they get pushed upward towards the most superficial layer, which is the corneum. Now, the basale is this deepest layer, and it's firmly attached to the dermis by the way of the basement membrane. And it consists of a single row of actively mitotic stem cells that produce daughter cells that then are pushed up superficially into the epidermis. One daughter cell kind of journeys from the basal layer towards the surface, and this can take up to 45 days to reach the surface, which is why we say that on average, you can replace your skin about once every 2 months or so. Now, cells actually die as they move towards the surface because your epidermis gets so thick that the cells towards the superficial layer are actually too far from their nutrient supply, so they start to undergo apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. Now, the other daughter cell actually remains in the basale and remains as that stem cell, which can regenerate and form new cells that can help regenerate your epidermis. Now, we also call the stratum basale stratum germinativum because it's the germinating layer of actively mitotic cells, And about 10 to 25% of these cells in this layer are melanocytes. Remember, these are the ones that make melanin. Stratum spinosum is also called the prickly layer, and these are several cell layers thick. This is just superficial to the basale, and these cells contain web-like system of intermediate prekeratin filaments. So in the stratum spinosum, these cells are already, the keratinocytes here are already starting to pack themselves full of prekeratin, and allows them to resist things like tension and pulling. Now, because of these, the shape of these cells, they appear spiky, hence the name spinosum. And they're scattered, with abundant melanosomes and dendritic cells. So these melanosomes are going to incorporate into the keratinocytes, and then dendritic cells actually kind of can scavenge around and look for microorganisms or debris to remove through phagocytosis. Stratum granulosum is called the granular layer. Now, it's about 4 cells thick, and these cells are flattened, so the layers are a little thinner. These start to undergo changes in appearance because the cells flatten, nuclei and organelles start to disintegrate. This is where keratinization begins, which is what gives these cells kind of a granular appearance. So these cells accumulate keratohyalin granules that actually help form keratin fibers, and because of this appearance, we call them granulosum. Now, these cells also accumulate lamellar granules, which are a water-resistant glycolipid that slows water loss. And cells above this layer begin death. Because if the organelles disintegrate and your nuclei disintegrates, there's no way to regenerate, damaged tissue or damaged cells rather, and they're too far from the dermal capillaries, like from their nutrient supply, to survive. Stratum lucidum is the clear layer, hence the name lucidum. So lucid means clear, and you only find this in thick skin. So it consists of kind of a thinner layer, or a translucent band of several cell layers of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes. They lie just superficial to the stratum granulosum, and hence the name lucidum. But remember, you only find stratum lucidum in thick skin. Now, stratum corneum is what you find in both thin and thick skin. You also call this the horny layer because it's hardened. Now, it's consisted of 20 to 30 rows of flat, anucleated, keratinized dead cells. So what's interesting is the most superficial layer of epidermis is actually made of dead cells. And it accounts for about 3/4 of epidermal thickness, so it's very thick. Now, though these cells are dead, they still function to protect deeper cells from your environment. They prevent water loss, they protect from abrasion, and act as a nice barrier against biological, chemical, and physical assaults. Now, as these cells are pushed more superficially, the cells undergo a process of apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. Now, these dead cells slough off as dandruff or dander, and humans can shed up to 50,000 keratinocytes every minute, which is why our epidermis needs to have a high regenerative capacity, and you're going to replace these cells about once every 45 days. So what this slide shows is essentially a pictorial view of these cell layers. Remember, we have 5 major layers in thick skin and 4 major layers in thin skin. This is showing an example of thin skin because we're actually missing stratum lucidum. But there's actually a really nice mnemonic to memorize these, and it goes, best skin gets love and care. Now, we don't have the love layer here because lucidum's not present, but it would be here. So best is stratum basale, skin is stratum spinosum, gets is stratum granulosum, and then love is lucidum, which isn't here, and then corneum is care. Now, that's just our mnemonic to memorize the cell layers. Now, basale, remember, is the single layer of actively dividing stem cells. You can see the dermis here, which has your nutrient supply, and it makes sense the cells that are dividing are closest to the nutrients. Stratum spinosum is called that because the cells kind of take on a spiny appearance, and they also start to pack themselves full of prekeratin. This is also where you find dendritic cells that can move around and kind of scavenge and look for microorganisms. Stratum granulosum is the granular appearance here. You can see these cells kind of have a granular sort of appearance in their cytoplasm. This is actually where keratinization begins, hence the granular appearance here. What's missing is the lucidum layer, and there should be a kind of a thin, clear layer here if this were thick skin. because this is thin skin, you don't have lucidum. Instead, we go straight from granulosum to corneum. So all of this is corneum. And you can identify this as corneum because there are no nuclei. Do you notice that none of these cells here have, the distinct nucleus? Because essentially these cells are dead. After granulosum, the cells undergo apoptosis and degradation of the nuclei and organelles. So what you're left with are essentially just bags of keratin that are, tightly bound together by intercellular junctions. And this outer corneum layer is kind of like the bark of the tree, on your skin, which is essentially an outer layer of dead cells, just like tree bark. And in fact, that's what cornea means. Like cortex means bark. And this is actually going to make up most of the thickness of your skin, and it's essentially made of dead cells, which are protective and they prevent water loss. And this is just showing the artist's representation of what we see over here, which is the light microscopy image. So over here we see our dermis, we see our stratum basale, we have our stratum spinosum with dendritic cells in it, stratum granulosum, and then corneum. Remember, our stratum basale has got 3 major cell types in there. Basale has got your keratinocytes that are dividing and replacing keratinocytes as your skin pushes upward. We have our melanocytes, which are spider-like projections that can inject melanosomes into growing keratinocytes. And we have our tactile or Merkel cells, which are involved with touch.